Picture a moment when the fate of an entire continent hung by a thread. The year was 1683, and the city of Vienna stood alone, encircled by the might of the Ottoman Empire. Its walls were the last line of defense between Europe and an unstoppable force, its people clinging to hope as the shadow of siege darkened their skies. This wasn't just a battle for territory, it was a clash of civilizations, a fight for survival that would echo through history. And at the heart of this desperate stand were 25 military geniuses whose brilliance, courage, and sheer determination turned the tide. Their names might not all be familiar, but their actions saved a city and perhaps a continent from collapse. What does it take to defy the impossible, to stare down overwhelming odds and refuse to yield? The Siege of Vienna is a story of such defiance, a tapestry woven with the strategies of visionary commanders, the grit of unsung heroes, and the unbreakable spirit of those who refused to let their world crumble. These 25 leaders didn't just fight, they outthought, outmaneuvered, and outlasted one of the most formidable armies the world had ever seen. From daring cavalry charges to ingenious defensive tactics, their decisions reshaped the battlefield and the future. This is more than a tale of war. It's a testament to the power of human ingenuity under pressure. As we unravel the stories of these military masterminds, you'll discover how their choices in those critical days didn't just save Vienna, they altered the course of history. How did a handful of commanders rally fractured forces into a unified defense? What unlikely alliances turned the tide? And what can we learn from their leadership today? Prepare to step into the siege that defined an era and meet the minds that stood between Europe and oblivion. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and the lessons couldn't be more timeless. To grasp the gravity of Vienna's struggle, we must first step into the shoes of those living in 1683. The Ottoman Empire wasn't just another enemy, it was a colossal force that had spent centuries expanding, its shadow stretching from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia. By the time Sultan Mehmed IV set his sights on Europe's heart, his armies were battle-hardened, his resources seemingly limitless, and his ambition unstoppable. Vienna wasn't merely a target, it was the key to unlocking the continent. If it fell, the road to Rome, Paris, and beyond would lie open, with nothing to halt the Ottoman advance. But Vienna was no ordinary city. Perched on the edge of Christian Europe, it had long been a fortress of faith and culture, its towering walls a symbol of resistance. For 2 brutal months, its people endured starvation, disease, and the constant thunder of cannon fire. The Ottomans dug tunnels beneath the city's defenses, lobbed incendiary shells over its walls, and launched wave after wave of assaults. Inside, supplies dwindled to near nothing. Hope faded with each passing day. Yet, against all logic, Vienna held. Why? Because its defenders understood something critical. This wasn't just a fight for land, it was a battle of wits. The Ottomans brought overwhelming numbers, but Vienna's leaders countered with cunning. They exploited every weakness in the siege lines, turned the city's narrow streets into death traps for invaders, and used the very walls that seemed like prisons to their advantage. The siege became a chess match, each move calculated to buy time until relief could arrive. And when the legendary Winged Hussars finally charged from the hills, their arrival wasn't just a moment of salvation, it was the culmination of months of strategic patience. This context matters because it reveals the true scale of what these 25 military minds were up against. They weren't just fighting an army, they were outthinking an empire. Every decision, from rationing food to repositioning troops under cover of darkness, had to be perfect. One misstep and Vienna, and perhaps Europe itself, would have been lost. The siege wasn't just a test of strength, it was a masterclass in leadership under fire, and that's what makes their stories worth telling. King John III Sobieski didn't just arrive at Vienna, he rewrote the rules of warfare in a single, thunderous moment. When Europe's fractured kingdoms hesitated, paralyzed by old rivalries and fear, the Polish king saw what others couldn't. Unity was the only weapon strong enough to break the Ottoman siege. His march to Vienna was a masterstroke of logistics and sheer willpower, moving 20,000 troops across the treacherous Carpathian Mountains in near total secrecy. While other commanders debated, Sobiski acted, turning a disjointed coalition into a hammer poised to strike. But his genius wasn't just in getting there, it was in knowing how to wield the force he'd assembled. The legendary Winged Hussars, Poland's elite cavalry, weren't just soldiers, they were a psychological weapon. Picture the terror of Ottoman troops as the horizon darkened with their shadow. The thunder of hooves, the glint of sunlight on lances, the wings strapped to their armor creating an unholy shriek as they charged. Sobiski didn't just send them forward, he timed their assault to perfection, waiting until the Ottoman forces were fully committed against Vienna's walls before unleashing them like a blade to the enemy's back. What made Sobiski truly exceptional, though, wasn't just his battlefield brilliance, it was his understanding of politics as war by other means. He coaxed cooperation from rivals who'd spent decades distrusting one another, convincing the Holy Roman Empire's cautious generals and Bavaria's proud princes to fight under a single banner. His famous letter to Pope Innocent XI after the victory didn't boast of personal glory. It simply read, "We came, we saw, God conquered." In that humility lay his real power, the ability to make victory about something larger than himself. The charge at Vienna didn't just scatter an army, it shattered the myth of Ottoman invincibility. For centuries, Europe had reacted to Ottoman expansion with fear. Sobiski proved they could fight back, and his tactics became a blueprint for future coalitions. Yet perhaps his greatest legacy was showing how leadership isn't just about commanding armies, it's about uniting them. Without him, the relief force might have remained a collection of squabbling factions, not the decisive instrument that saved a continent. That's why, when the Winged Hussars crested the hills that September morning, they carried more than lances, they carried the future of Europe. Duke Charles V of Lorraine may not have led the cavalry charge that history remembers, but without his razor-sharp mind, there would have been no charge to begin with. While Sobiski's Winged Hussars stole the spotlight, it was Charles who built the stage they fought on thread by thread, decision by decision. Imagine trying to coordinate an army made up of Germans, Austrians, and Poles, each with their own commanders, egos, and battle traditions, all while racing against time to save a starving city. That was the impossible task Charles turned into reality. His genius lay in the invisible details, the kind most history books overlook. Supply lines stretched for hundreds of miles, yet his troops never starved. Communication between rival factions could have collapsed into chaos, yet orders flowed smoothly. Even the terrain became his ally as he studied every hill and valley between the Danube and Vienna, using the land itself to mask his army's movements. When the Ottomans expected reinforcements to arrive exhausted and fragmented, Charles delivered them rested, unified, and perfectly positioned. But what truly set him apart was his ability to adapt. Halfway to Vienna, scouts reported that the Ottomans had fortified a key river crossing. A lesser commander might have wasted weeks trying to batter through. Charles simply changed course, marching his forces through a treacherous mountain past the enemy had dismissed as impassable. That single decision shaved crucial days off their advanced days that meant the difference between a city saved or lost. His tactics didn't just outmaneuver the Ottomans, they outthought them. While the Sultan's generals focused on breaching Vienna's walls, Charles exploited their blind spots, cutting off their supply depots and harassing their flanks. By the time Sobiski's hussars charged, the Ottoman army was already off balance. Their attention split between the city they couldn't take and the trap Charles had spent weeks carefully setting. History loves the flash of a cavalry charge, but victory at Vienna was forged long before the first lance lowered. It was built on Charles's relentless preparation, his knack for turning obstacles into opportunities, and his quiet mastery of war's most underrated skill, logistics. In an age where generals sought glory, he understood that true leadership wasn't about being seen, it was about seeing what others missed. Ernst Rudiger von Starhemburg didn't just defend Vienna, he became its beating heart. Picture a city on the brink, its walls crumbling, its people starving, and its hope fading with each passing hour. With fewer than 15,000 soldiers against an Ottoman force 10 times that size, any rational commander would have surrendered. But Starhemburg wasn't just rational, he was relentless. His genius wasn't in the size of his army, but in how he wielded it, turning every alley, every barricade, every crumbling tower into a weapon. His first move was psychological warfare. Knowing the Ottomans expected a quick collapse, Starhemburg made Vienna look stronger than it was. He ordered bonfires lit along unmanned sections of the walls at night, creating the illusion of vast numbers. He had troops rotate uniforms to make it seem fresh reinforcements kept arriving. When Ottoman sappers dug tunnels to plant explosives beneath the city's defenses, Starhemburg's engineers dug counter-tunnels, flooding the enemy's passages with smoke and water. Each small victory bought time, and time was the one resource Vienna couldn't afford to waste. But his real mastery lay in morale. A starving, terrified populace could have turned on itself, yet Starhemburg made sure every citizen felt like a defender. He organized women and children into supply chains, delivering food and ammunition to the walls. He walked the battlements daily, muddy and bloodied alongside the lowest-ranking soldiers, sharing their rations and their risks. When a rumor spread that the Ottomans had breached the inner city, he didn't hide in his command post. He grabbed a pike and led the countercharge personally, his presence alone enough to steady the line. The toll was unimaginable. By the siege's final weeks, Vienna's defenders were eating rats and boiling leather for broth. Artillery fire had reduced entire neighborhoods to rubble. Yet Starhemburg's resolve never wavered. He knew one truth the Ottomans underestimated. A city isn't just stone and mortar, it's the will of those inside it. And as long as he stood, that will remained unbroken. When Sobiski's Winged Hussars finally appeared on the horizon, it wasn't just a relief force arriving, it was the vindication of Starhemburg's stubborn faith. He'd held the line for 60 days against impossible odds, not through sheer force, but by outthinking, outlasting, and outbelieving his enemy. His legacy isn't just in the battles won, but in the lesson he left behind. True leadership isn't about having the most resources. It's about making the most of what you have and inspiring others to do the same. Marco Deviano wielded a weapon no Ottoman army could counter: unshakable faith. While kings plotted battle lines and generals drilled troops, this humble Capuchin friar moved through the camps like a force of nature, his words igniting something deeper than courage in the hearts of weary soldiers. Imagine the scene: thousands of men, exhausted by months of marching, their uniforms ragged, their stomachs hollow, gathered under torchlight as Deviano's voice cut through the night. He didn't just preach, he transformed fear into fury, doubt into defiance. To the defenders of Vienna, he wasn't merely a priest, he was the living embodiment of their cause, a reminder that they fought not just for land, but for survival itself. Yet his brilliance extended far beyond the pulpit. In an era when religious divisions often fractured alliances, Deviano became the glue that held them together. He traveled tirelessly between the tents of Polish Hussars, German infantry, and Italian mercenaries, smoothing over rivalries with a mix of charisma and cunning. When Bavarian commanders bristled at taking orders from Sobiski, it was Deviano who brokered peace. When Venetian troops threatened to abandon the march over unpaid wages, he persuaded them to stay with promises of divine favor and discreetly arranged for their back pay. His diplomacy turned a patchwork army into a united front, proving that faith could achieve what politics alone could not. What set him apart, though, was his grasp of strategy. Unlike other chaplains who focused solely on morale, Deviano studied maps alongside generals, his keen mind spotting opportunities others missed. He recognized how the Ottomans' rigid chain of command could be exploited, urging Sobiski to strike during Ramadan when fasting troops would be weakest. He proposed using church bells across the city as a signaling system, their peals coordinating counterattacks when messengers couldn't get through. Even his sermons doubled as intelligence operations. Penitent soldiers confessing in his tent often revealed crucial details about Ottoman positions, which he quietly passed to commanders. The morning of the final battle revealed his masterpiece. As dawn broke, Deviano led every soldier in prayer, then did something unprecedented. He walked the front lines holding aloft a crucifix, blessing each regiment in their native tongue. Polish, German, Croatian, he spoke them all, a living bridge between cultures. When the Winged Hussars charged hours later, many swore they saw his figure silhouetted against the smoke, still praying as the tide turned. Deviano's legacy isn't just in the souls he stirred, but in the lesson he embodied. That war is waged in the mind and spirit long before swords clash. In an age obsessed with gunpowder and fortifications, he proved that belief could be the ultimate weapon, and that sometimes the most powerful strategy is making people remember what they're fighting for. Jorg Friedrich of Waldeck didn't need the roar of cannons or the flash of a cavalry charge to shape history. His battlefield was the ledger, the map, and the supply wagon. While kings and generals took the glory, Waldeck worked in the shadows, solving problems most commanders never noticed until it was too late. Picture an army stretched across hundreds of miles of rugged terrain, its ranks filled with soldiers from a dozen rival nations, each speaking different languages, eating different foods, and following different customs. Keeping such a force moving should have been impossible. Yet Waldeck made it look effortless. His brilliance lay in the mundane details that could make or break a campaign. When Bavarian troops ran low on gunpowder, he rerouted shipments from distant depots without missing a beat. When Polish Hussars demanded the specific type of oats their horses needed, he ensured they arrived fresh, even if it meant bartering with skeptical local farmers. While others focused on tactics, Waldeck obsessed over the math. How many pounds of bread per soldier per day? How many nails to repair a wagon axle? How many couriers to keep orders flowing between scattered units? His calculations were the invisible threads holding the entire alliance together. What set him apart wasn't just efficiency, it was foresight. Weeks before the army reached Vienna, Waldeck stockpiled medical supplies near anticipated battle sites, anticipating the butcher's bill of siege warfare. He commandeered mills along the Danube to grind grain into flour, eliminating delays. He even arranged for fishermen to patrol the river at night, not for combat, but to catch fresh fish to supplement dwindling rations. Every decision was a quiet masterstroke, each one averting a potential disaster before it could unravel the coalition's fragile unity. The true test of his skill came during the final push to Vienna. Torrential rains turned roads to mud, stalling artillery transports critical to the relief effort. While others panicked, Waldeck mobilized every available ox and draft horse, redistributing loads and rerouting columns along higher ground. He didn't just solve the crisis, he turned it into an advantage, using the delay to reposition supplies closer to the front lines. By the time the sun broke through, his adjustments had shaved precious hours off the march. History remembers the roar of Sobiski's hussars, but without Waldeck's silent orchestration, those lances would have arrived to a starving, scattered force. His legacy is a lesson in the unglamorous foundations of victory. Wars aren't won by valor alone, but by the unsung masters of the mundane who ensure armies don't just fight, they function. In an era of flamboyant heroes, Waldeck proved that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply making sure everyone gets fed. Jerzy Franciszek Kulksiki didn't just move between worlds, he turned the space between enemies into his greatest advantage. A merchant fluent in Turkish, Hungarian, and half a dozen other languages, he wore his outsider status like armor. While soldiers peered anxiously over Vienna's walls, Kulksiki slipped beneath them, disguised as an Ottoman trader, his cart loaded not with weapons but with something far more dangerous information. Every sack of grain hid coded messages. Every barrel of wine carried whispers of enemy troop movements. The Ottomans never suspected the unassuming merchant haggling in their markets was mapping their siege lines for the defenders. His most audacious move came when Vienna's communication lines were severed. With the city isolated, Kulksiki volunteered to cross no man's land under cover of darkness, swimming icy canals and crawling through sewage tunnels to deliver Starhemburg's pleas for help to waiting couriers. Ottoman sentries stood mere feet away as he held his breath in the reeds, their torchlight flickering over the water where he floated motionless. One slip, one cough, and the siege would have ended very differently. Yet he made the journey not once but 3 times, each trip tightening the noose around the invaders without them ever realizing it. But Kulksiki's legacy extends beyond espionage. When the siege broke and the Ottomans fled, they left behind sacks of strange dark beans coffee, then virtually unknown in Europe. Where others saw worthless plunder, Kulksiki recognized opportunity. Using his knowledge of Turkish customs, he roasted the beans over an open fire, grinding them into the bitter brew he'd seen Ottoman officers drink. The Viennese initially recoiled at the taste, until he added honey and milk, creating the first cappuccino, the ancestor of every cappuccino sipped in cafes today. Within months, he'd opened the Blue Bottle, Vienna's first coffeehouse, turning a wartime trophy into a cultural revolution. His story defies simple labels. Was he a spy, an entrepreneur, a cultural bridge? Perhaps he was proof that history's most pivotal figures aren't always those who wield swords, but those who see connections others miss. While kings plotted grand strategies, Kulksiki mastered the art of the small, the unnoticed crack in enemy defenses, the forgotten sack of beans, the unspoken trust between rivals. In a conflict defined by walls and divisions, he thrived in the spaces between, turning the margins into the center of the story. And in doing so, he left Vienna not just victorious but forever changed. Count Enya Silvio Picolamine didn't just lead cavalry, he redefined what cavalry could do. While other commanders saw horsemen as blunt instruments for massed charges, Picolamine treated his riders like surgical tools, each movement calculated to inflict maximum damage with minimal risk. His strategy was simple in theory but revolutionary in execution. Never engage the enemy's main force head-on. Instead, his light horsemen struck like shadows, vanishing into the countryside after ambushing Ottoman supply convoys, feinting attacks to draw troops away from critical positions, then melting back into the terrain before reinforcements could arrive. What made his tactics so devastating was their psychological toll. The Ottomans, accustomed to set-piece battles, found themselves fighting an enemy they couldn't pin down. Piccolamine's riders would appear without warning, setting fire to grain stores or cutting down stragglers, then dissolve into the forests before retaliation was possible. Each raid chipped away at the invaders' morale, transforming their march toward Vienna from a triumphant advance into a nerve-wracking gauntlet. Even the weather became his ally. On foggy mornings, his forces would launch decoy attacks from multiple directions, leaving the Ottomans exhausted and disoriented before the real strike came. But Picolamine's genius wasn't just in harassment. He understood that warfare was as much about logistics as combat. By systematically targeting Ottoman supply depots, he forced their commanders to divert thousands of troops to guard wagon trains instead of reinforcing the siege. When the enemy shortened their supply lines, he shifted to destroying bridges and poisoning wells, turning the land itself into a weapon. These weren't random acts of sabotage. They were precise, calculated moves designed to weaken the Ottoman army long before it faced Sobiski's relief force. His legacy extended far beyond Vienna. The hit-and-run tactics he perfected became the blueprint for light cavalry across Europe, inspiring generations of commanders to prioritize mobility over sheer numbers. More importantly, he proved that victory didn't always require a climactic battle. Sometimes, the war was won in the quiet moments between clashes, in the relentless erosion of an enemy's strength and will. While history remembers the thunder of Winged Hussars, it was Piccolamine's silent, systematic dismantling of Ottoman power that made their charge possible. Prince Eugene of Savoy didn't wait for permission to become a legend. He seized history by the throat at 19. While older commanders debated tactics in war tents, this teenage aristocrat was already studying the battlefield with the intensity of a seasoned general. Picture him, slight of frame, barely more than a boy, yet moving through Vienna's besieged streets with the confidence of someone who knew he was destined to reshape warfare. His youth wasn't a weakness, it was his secret weapon. Where veterans saw obstacles, Eugene saw opportunities, the undefended gully perfect for a flanking maneuver, the overlooked ridge that could hide an entire regiment. What set him apart wasn't just raw courage, it was his preternatural grasp of terrain. While others focused on troop numbers, Eugene obsessively mapped every dip and curve of the land around Vienna. He noticed how sound carried strangely in the river valleys, allowing his scouts to eavesdrop on Ottoman patrols. He spotted how morning fog pooled in certain depressions, perfect for masking troop movements. These weren't just observations, they were the building blocks of a tactical philosophy he'd later used to shatter French and Ottoman armies across Europe. His defining moment came during a nighttime sortie against Ottoman siege lines. Older officers advised caution, but Eugene argued for audacity, leading a small band of volunteers through a neglected drainage ditch to torch enemy artillery positions. The raid shouldn't have worked, yet by dawn, a dozen Ottoman cannons lay smoldering, their crews scattered. It was a microcosm of his future campaigns, meticulous preparation paired with lightning strikes where least expected. The siege became Eugene's crucible. Watching seasoned commanders like Starhemburg and Sobiski, he absorbed their strengths while discarding their weaknesses. He saw how logistics could win wars as surely as battles, how psychology could break enemies before swords crossed. These lessons would later make him the scourge of the Ottomans at Zenta and the architect of French defeats in Italy. But here at Vienna, the blueprint was drawn, not in ink, but in the relentless curiosity of a teenager who refused to accept limits. History loves the symmetry of his story, the young outsider who became Europe's shield. Yet what's often forgotten is how Vienna forged him. The city didn't just survive because of its defenders, it survived because among them stood a boy who saw war not as it was, but as it could be. And in that vision lay the seeds of victories yet to come. War often turns on secrets, and few kept more than the Janissaries who abandoned the Ottoman ranks to fight for Vienna. These weren't mere deserters, they were elite soldiers raised from childhood in the Sultan's service, trained in every nuance of Ottoman warfare. Their defections struck at the empire's core, not just weakening its forces but exposing its most guarded tactics. Picture the scene, a huddled conference in Vienna's war rooms, where men who once wore the Janissary's white cap now sketched siege layouts in charcoal, revealing where explosives would be planted, how troops rotated shifts, even the precise rhythms of their commanders' decision-making. This wasn't just intelligence, it was a master key to Ottoman strategy. What drove these warriors to betray the only life they'd known? Some spoke of growing disillusionment with the siege's brutality, the waste of lives thrown endlessly at Vienna's walls. Others whispered of favors owed to Habsburg spies or private grievances against arrogant commanders. But beneath every motive lay a deeper truth. The Janissaries, for all their fearsome reputation, were human. They'd witnessed the Ottoman war machine's cracks, the supply shortages hushed up by proud officers, the rivalries between factions that left flanks vulnerable. Their defections weren't just acts of survival, they were calculations that the empire's glory days might be fading. Their impact was immediate and profound. When Starhemburg learned from defectors that the Ottomans planned to mine beneath the Lurbel bastion, he ordered counter-tunnels dug in precise locations, collapsing enemy passages before they could detonate. Defectors also revealed a critical weakness. The Janissaries' famed discipline relied on rigid hierarchies, removed key officers, and entire units could falter. This intelligence shaped Sobiski's final assault, where targeted strikes against command tents triggered chaos in the Ottoman ranks. Yet these defectors embodied war's cruelest irony. To save Vienna, they had to dismantle the very system that forged them. Their knowledge didn't just expose tactics, it laid bare the Janissaries' unsustainable ideals. The elite corps, once the empire's backbone, had grown bloated and politically entangled, its warriors torn between loyalty and self-preservation. In switching sides, they didn't just change allegiances, they became harbingers of the Ottoman decline still decades away. Their stories remind us that even history's grandest conflicts hinge not just on armies, but on the individuals who choose, sometimes at terrible cost, to rewrite their own destinies. The ground trembled before the Ottoman soldiers, even saw them 3,000 Polish Winged Hussars descending the Culmenberg heights like a storm given form. Sunlight glinted off their iconic wings, tall wooden frames strapped to their backs that hissed and whistled with the wind, creating an unearthly chorus. But this wasn't just theater, it was psychological warfare perfected. Those wings made the Hussars appear larger, more terrifying, transforming a cavalry charge into something supernatural. By the time the Ottomans heard the thunder of hooves, it was already too late. What made the Hussars unstoppable wasn't just their armor or lances, it was their chilling discipline. While other heavy cavalry of the era relied on wild, headlong rushes, the Hussars moved as one living weapon. They advanced at a controlled trot until the final 300 paces, conserving their horses' energy. Then, on a single shouted command, they erupted into full gallop without breaking formation. Each rider knew his exact position, each lance angled to maximize the wall of impact. When they struck the Ottoman flank, it wasn't a collision, it was a calculated demolition. Their timing at Vienna was no accident. Sobiski had held them back for hours, letting the Ottomans exhaust themselves against the city's defenses. Only when enemy ranks were tightly packed, their reserves committed, did he unleash the Hussars at the perfect angle to slice through like a scalpel. The effect was catastrophic. Ottoman troops, already fatigued from months of siege, found themselves caught between Vienna's stubborn defenders and this sudden hammer blow from the rear. Within minutes, orderly ranks disintegrated into panicked retreat. Yet the Hussars' true brilliance lay in what happened after the charge. While lesser cavalry might have pursued fleeing enemies and scattered, they wheeled in flawless unison to strike again at fresh targets. Their training allowed them to maintain cohesion even in the chaos of battle, reforming ranks with almost mechanical precision. This wasn't mindless valor. It was a masterclass in controlled violence, where every movement served a larger strategy. Their legacy transcends Vienna. The Winged Hussars became a symbol of Europe's ability to rally against overwhelming odds, their charge a metaphor for turning the tide. But perhaps their greatest lesson is subtler. That true power lies not in numbers alone, but in the fusion of skill, timing, and sheer audacity. When history needed a miracle, the Hussars didn't just deliver, they redefined what was possible. Imperial engineers didn't just build Vienna's defenses, they turned the city itself into a living, breathing weapon. While soldiers fought on the ramparts, these unsung masters of stone and earth worked tirelessly behind the scenes, their hands blackened with gunpowder and mortar. Each night, as Ottoman cannon fire subsided, teams of sappers and architects would emerge like ghosts, repairing shattered walls with makeshift materials, crushed brick mixed with horsehair for elasticity, wooden beams braced at precise angles to redistribute weight. They didn't just patch damage, they re-engineered weaknesses in real time, learning from every impact to make the next section stronger. What set them apart was their ingenuity under fire. When the Ottomans began tunneling beneath the city's bastions, Vienna's engineers didn't wait passively. They designed an early warning system using hollowed-out drums half-filled with dried peas. Placed along suspect corridors, the slightest vibration would send the peas dancing, alerting defenders to enemy activity below. Then came their Masterstroke countermines. Digging their own tunnels at intersecting angles, they packed these narrow passages with barrels of black powder, collapsing Ottoman excavations in thunderous chain reactions. It wasn't just brute force, it was geometry turned lethal, each explosion calculated to maximize subterranean chaos. Their brilliance extended above ground too. Recognizing that Vienna's medieval walls couldn't withstand modern artillery, they transformed the city's streets into layered kill zones. Barricades of overturned wagons and furniture funneled attackers into narrow alleys where defenders could pick them off from rooftops. Even the rubble had purpose. Collapsed buildings were deliberately left unstable, creating death traps that could be triggered with a single rope pull when Ottoman troops passed through. Every brick, every splintered beam became part of the defense. Perhaps their most daring feat was the fake breach. After one particularly devastating bombardment left a section of wall near collapse, engineers deliberately weakened it further, but rigged the area with hidden trenches and sharpened stakes. When Ottoman troops poured through what they thought was their breakthrough, they found themselves trapped in a killing box, raked by crossfire from hidden emplacements. The engineers didn't just defend Vienna, they weaponized the Ottomans' own expectations against them. These men rarely appear in paintings of the siege, their faces lost to history. But their legacy reshaped warfare forever. Vienna proved that victory wasn't just about courage or numbers, it was about problem solving under impossible pressure, about turning limitations into advantages. Long after the last cannon fell silent, their lessons echoed in fortresses across Europe, that the strongest walls aren't made of stone alone, but of the minds that know how to make them breathe. Amid the smoke and screams of battle, an often overlooked group of heroes worked tirelessly: Vienna's medical corps, whose innovations in the chaos of siege warfare saved as many lives as any sword or cannon. While history remembers the thunder of cavalry charges, it was these healers who sustained the city's spirit by proving that even in hell, compassion could still thrive. Their methods were born of necessity. With surgeons outnumbered by the wounded 10-1, they pioneered a crude but effective triage system, sorting casualties into those who could fight another day, those who might survive with care, and those beyond help. It was a brutal calculus, but one that allowed them to stretch dwindling supplies and manpower to their limits. What set these medics apart wasn't just their skill, it was their defiance of despair. In cellars converted into makeshift hospitals, they boiled rags to prevent infection centuries before germ theory was understood. They mixed honey into wound dressings, harnessing its natural antibacterial properties. Even something as simple as separating the dying from the treatable became revolutionary, preventing panic and allowing the wounded to believe recovery was possible. When Ottoman sappers collapsed a section of wall, burying dozens, these healers dug through rubble with bare hands alongside soldiers, proving that every life, whether a general or a grocer, was worth fighting for. Their most profound contribution, though, was invisible morale. In a city where starvation and dysentery raged, the mere presence of orderly medical tents became a symbol of hope. Word spread of a physician who amputated a gangrenous leg by candlelight, saving the patient with nothing but a saw and silk thread. Another story told of nurses who smuggled food to orphan children between shifts. These small acts of humanity became as vital as rations, reminding Vienna's defenders that they weren't just fighting to survive, they were fighting for a world worth returning to. The siege aftermath revealed their true legacy. While the Ottomans lost thousands to disease and untreated wounds, Vienna's defenders maintained surprising cohesion, thanks in large part to medics who kept the ranks patched together. Their techniques, born of desperation, would later influence military medicine across Europe. But perhaps their greatest lesson was timeless, that in war, the will to heal can be as powerful as the will to destroy. Long after the last cannon fell silent, it was their stubborn belief in saving lives, not just taking them, that truly defined victory. Vienna's artillery commanders faced what should have been a hopeless equation, outnumbered 3-1 in cannons, with gunpowder reserves dwindling by the hour. Yet these masters of trajectory and timing didn't just level the playing field, they rewrote the rules of siege warfare. While Ottoman gunners pounded Vienna's walls with indiscriminate barrages, the city's defenders took a scalpel to chaos. Each shot was calculated, each target chosen not for spectacle but for maximum disruption. A single well-placed iron ball could cripple a siege tower under construction, buying precious days. A lucky hit on a powder magazine might erase an entire Ottoman battery in one fiery bloom. This wasn't just marksmanship, it was psychological chess, making every thunderclap count twice, once in damage dealt, and again in the enemy's growing hesitation. The true genius lay in their adaptability. When standard rounds proved ineffective against earthen Ottoman fortifications, gunners improvised chain shot, or two iron halves linked by metal, whirling through the air to tear through supply wagons and artillery crews like a scythe. Others heated cannonballs until they glowed red-hot before firing, turning them into incendiary missiles that ignited wooden siege engines on impact. Resource scarcity bred innovation. With bronze cannons overheating, crews soaked blankets in vinegar and wrapped them around barrels to cool faster, nearly doubling their rate of fire. Even the city's church bells became tools, their peals synchronized to mask the sound of cannons being repositioned under cover of darkness. What set these commanders apart was their grasp of asymmetric warfare. Instead of dueling directly with Ottoman artillery, a fight they'd lose, they focused on vulnerabilities. Supply caravans making their way up the Danube became prime targets, forcing the enemy to divert thousands of troops to guard routes. When scouts reported Ottoman commanders gathering for a strategy session, Vienna's gunners didn't waste shots on random walls. They bracketed the tent with measured volleys, scattering leadership at critical moments. This wasn't random violence, it was systemic sabotage designed to unravel the siege thread by thread. Their crowning achievement came in the siege's final weeks. Learning that the Ottomans had concentrated their remaining gunpowder in a single depot near the front lines, Vienna's artillery executed a near-impossible feat, a parabolic shot over defensive berms, landing directly in the storage pit. The resulting explosion lit up the night sky for miles, crippling Ottoman offensive capabilities just as Sobiski's relief force arrived. In that moment, the gunners proved their quiet thesis, that in war, precision can outweigh volume and ingenuity can trump sheer might. While history often remembers the flash of cavalry charges, Vienna's artillery commanders authored a different kind of heroism, one measured in angles, trajectories, and the patience to wait for the perfect shot. Their legacy wasn't just in the walls they preserved, but in the lesson they etched into military strategy. That true firepower isn't about how much you have, but how wisely you use it. The cobblestone streets of Vienna didn't just belong to soldiers, they belonged to the baker who knew every cellar passage, the student who could navigate rooftops blindfolded, the blacksmith who reforged broken pikes into weapons between customers. When the siege began, these weren't just civilians, they were the city's secret weapon, their ordinary lives transformed into extraordinary assets. Imagine a tailor mapping Ottoman troop movements from his attic window, or a tavern keeper leading night raids using back alleys only locals could find. This was urban warfare rewritten by those who knew Vienna's heartbeat better than any invading army ever could. What made these makeshift defenders so lethal wasn't just their numbers, it was their intimacy with the terrain. While Ottoman troops stumbled through unfamiliar streets, militias turned the city itself into a labyrinth of death. They barricaded bridges with furniture from their own homes, booby-trapped doorways with tools from their workshops, even used church bells to signal attacks in coded peals. A brewer's knowledge of underground storage vaults became the key to smuggling supplies past enemy lines. A cobbler's knack for silent movement allowed him to slip into Ottoman camps, sabotaging cannon wheels with precisely placed knife strokes. Every skill, no matter how mundane, found brutal purpose under siege. Their courage defied all logic. With no formal training, they held sections of wall against professional soldiers, using boiling oil meant for cooking and farming scythes reforged into blades. When the Lerbel bastion nearly fell, it wasn't just soldiers who rushed the breach. It was a wave of printers, bakers, and even clergymen, armed with nothing but iron will. The Ottomans expected to fight an army. They found themselves battling an entire city, where every window might hide an archer, every doorway a trap. Yet perhaps their greatest contribution was intangible. In the darkest days when professional soldiers wavered, these citizen fighters became the embodiment of Vienna's refusal to break. A grandmother dragging wounded men to safety, children smuggling water to forward positions, these acts didn't just sustain defenses, they redefined what resistance meant. War wasn't just the domain of kings and generals anymore. It belonged to anyone willing to stand their ground. The siege's aftermath revealed the true genius of this mobilization. Unlike mercenaries who might desert or nobles with divided loyalties, these militias fought for something no invader could understand: home. Their victory wasn't just in holding walls, but in proving that courage isn't born, it's forged in the moments when ordinary people choose to become something more. Long after the last Ottoman banner retreated, Vienna remembered the lesson they embodied, that a city's strongest walls aren't made of stone, but of the hands willing to defend them. While swords clashed outside Vienna's walls, a different kind of battle unfolded in candlelit chambers and muddy encampments, one where words carried the weight of armies. Diplomats like Francesco Morosini of Venice and Johann Weikart von Auersperg of Austria wielded quills instead of blades, their ink-stained fingers redrawing the map of alliances with every carefully phrased letter. Their mission seemed impossible: to unite fractious European powers who'd spent generations at each other's throats. The Holy Roman Empire's princes distrusted the Polish crown, Bavaria's elector hesitated to commit troops, and Spain's Habsburgs were embroiled in their own wars. Yet these envoys turned skepticism into solidarity through sheer force of persuasion. Morosini's genius lay in framing Vienna's crisis as a shared catastrophe. To the French, traditionally wary of Habsburg power, he emphasized how Ottoman control of the Danube would strangle Mediterranean trade. For German princes, he painted vivid scenarios of Turkish raiders reaching their own borders unchecked. Even Pope Innocent XI, initially reluctant to fund yet another war, received meticulously detailed reports showing how Vienna's fall would leave Rome exposed. Each audience heard a tailored argument, their self-interest skillfully woven into the broader tapestry of survival. Von Auersperg, meanwhile, worked the human terrain with equal precision. Recognizing that distrust often stemmed from petty slights, he orchestrated carefully staged encounters, ensuring rival commanders accidentally crossed paths at shared meals where wine and battlefield stories smoothed tensions. When Polish Hussars grumbled about serving under German generals, he brokered a face-saving compromise, separate but coordinated commands. His most audacious move came when Saxon troops threatened to withdraw over unpaid wages. Lacking funds, he pledged his family's silverware as collateral, a gesture that shamed hesitant treasurers into releasing coins. The true measure of their success wasn't just in treaties signed, but in the unspoken trust they cultivated. Courier networks they established allowed Sobiski to coordinate with Starhemburg despite weeks of travel between their positions. Merchant contacts in neutral states smuggled saltpeter for gunpowder through Ottoman blockades. Even the timing of the relief force's arrival, perfectly synchronized with Vienna's last reserves of strength, was no accident, but the result of diplomats relentlessly harmonizing dozens of moving parts. These unsung strategists proved that wars aren't won by armies alone. For every Hussar who charged down the Culmenberg, there was a diplomat who ensured he arrived fed, armed, and flanked by allies who'd once been rivals. Their legacy lives on in every modern coalition, a reminder that the pen's most powerful stroke isn't signing surrender, it's writing the conditions for victory before the first sword is drawn. Swift riders on lathered horses and silent observers crouched in roadside thickets became Vienna's invisible lifeline, the sprawling scout network that turned the fog of war into a clear battlefield map. While the Ottomans relied on traditional chain of command delays, these scouts operated like a living nervous system, relaying updates with breathtaking speed. A shepherd spotting troop movements from a distant hill could pass word to a charcoal burner, who'd whisper it to a nun tending refugees, and within hours that intelligence would be in Starhemburg's hands. This wasn't just reconnaissance, it was an early form of crowdsourced warfare, where every civilian with sharp eyes became a sensor in the defense grid. What made these networks so effective was their adaptability. When Ottoman patrols began intercepting riders, scouts switched to dead drops, hollowed trees stuffed with coded notes, or laundry hung in prearranged patterns on village clotheslines. One particularly daring group used trained dogs to carry messages across no man's land, their collars hiding tiny parchment scrolls. Others exploited the Ottomans' own supply lines, disguising themselves as water carriers to move freely through enemy camps. The information they gathered wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. Reports on Ottoman morale, supply shortages, Even the superstitions of their officers allowed Vienna's commanders to wage war on the enemy's mind as well as their ranks. The system reached its zenith with the Moonlight Riders, elite couriers who memorized messages rather than risk carrying written orders, selected for their photographic recall and fluency in multiple dialects. They could slip through checkpoints by blending in as deserters or traders. One such rider, a former actor named Lukas Hirsch, reportedly recited a 23-point Ottoman battle plan verbatim after spending 3 days posing as a camp entertainer. His performance didn't just earn him coins, it revealed the exact timing of the next major assault, allowing Vienna to reinforce the threatened sector just in time. Scouts also mastered the art of strategic deception. When they wanted the Ottomans to believe Vienna was starving, riders allowed themselves to be captured with hollowed-out bread loaves stuffed with sawdust. To exaggerate the size of Sobiski's approaching relief force, they spread rumors at Ottoman campfires and staged elaborate dust clouds by dragging brush behind spare horses. Every piece of misinformation was tailored to exploit known Ottoman anxieties, their fear of European unity, their superstitions about certain dates, even their distrust of junior officers. The true measure of their success came in the siege's final days. Scouts pinpointed the exact moment Ottoman sappers would detonate their last major mine beneath the city walls, allowing defenders to evacuate the area beforehand. They tracked the depletion of enemy powder reserves to the hour, enabling Vienna's artillery to conserve ammunition until the critical moment. And when Sobiski's army finally appeared on the horizon, it was scout signals, mirror flashes from church steeples, arrow messages fired over the walls that coordinated the breakout attacks with precision. These unsung operatives proved that battles aren't won by brute force alone, but by the quality of information guiding each decision. Their legacy lives on in modern military intelligence, but perhaps their greatest lesson was simpler. That knowledge, when gathered swiftly and shared fearlessly, can be the deadliest weapon of all. Beneath their chainmail and rough-spun robes, the warrior monks of Vienna carried something more potent than blades, an unshakable conviction that this fight transcended earthly kingdoms. While soldiers manned the walls, these knights of faith moved through the ranks like living torches, their very presence a reminder that the siege wasn't just about territory, but the soul of a continent. The Teutonic Knights, their black crosses stark against battered armor, didn't merely fight, they transformed battlefields into altars, leading prayers amid the whistle of arrows. Their dual vows of piety and combat made them walking contradictions, equally adept at swinging a mace or administering last rites to dying men in the mud. What set them apart wasn't just their skill in war, but their ability to weaponize hope. When supplies ran low, Benedictine monks turned monastery gardens into makeshift hospitals, using herbs from their own plots to stave off infection. Augustinian friars, trained in both scripture and surgery, stitched wounds with thread pulled from their own habits. Even the simple act of holding a dying soldier's hand became strategic. Rumors spread of a wounded man glimpsing angels over the shoulder of a praying knight, a story that hardened resolve across the defenses. The Ottomans had numbers. Vienna had something far more dangerous. Men who believed heaven itself watched the battle. Their influence reached beyond the spiritual. The Knights Hospitaller, veterans of centuries of holy wars, brought ruthless pragmatism to the defense. They turned cathedrals into armories, melted down church silver for bullets, and repurposed communion wine as disinfectant. One friar, a former engineer before taking vows, redesigned the city's barricades using principles from ancient monastic fortresses, layered defenses that forced attackers into killing zones reminiscent of labyrinthine cloisters. Faith didn't blind them to reality, it sharpened their ingenuity. Yet perhaps their most profound impact was in the quiet moments. As the siege dragged on, these warrior priests became living bridges between terror and resolve. A Dominican friar's confession heard in the lee of a shattered wall could steady a trembling musketeer. A Franciscan's shared crust of bread with a starving child reminded defenders what they fought for. Their greatest weapon wasn't the sword at their hip, but the certainty in their voices when they declared this city would not fall. The Ottomans, for all their military might, never accounted for this invisible force. They understood sieges as equations of men and material, not as battles where a whispered prayer could stiffen spines more effectively than a whip. When the final assault came and Vienna's defenders stood firm against overwhelming odds, it wasn't just walls that held. It was the unbreakable will of those who'd convinced an entire city that they fought under the gaze of something greater. Long after the siege, veterans would speak not of the blood or the smoke, but of the sound of monks chanting as they marched toward the breach, their voices rising above the clamor of war like a promise. Supply officers didn't just move barrels of grain and bundles of arrows, they orchestrated a silent symphony of survival under the noses of an encircling army. Picture this: while Vienna's defenders clashed with Ottoman troops atop the walls, these unsung strategists were weaving an invisible web of supply lines through enemy territory. Every loaf of bread, every quiver of bolts, every cask of gunpowder that reached the city's gates was a minor miracle, snatched from the jaws of disaster by sheer logistical cunning. Their work was as critical as any cavalry charge, though far less celebrated. Without them, the defenders would have been holding empty cannons and starving bellies long before Sobiski's relief force arrived. The challenges they faced would break most modern logisticians. Ottoman raiders patrolled every road, their cavalry sweeping the countryside for anything that might sustain Vienna. Bridges were destroyed, wells poisoned, farms burned to deny resources. Yet somehow, supply officers kept the lifeline open. Their secret, a network of river barges disguised as fishing boats, slipping down the Danube under cover of darkness with hulls full of salted meat and lead shot. They recruited local shepherds to drive flocks of sheep through hidden mountain passes, their bleating drowned out by distant cannon fire. Even the city's sewers became supply routes, with barrels of gunpowder floated through tunnels too narrow for Ottoman soldiers to penetrate. But their true genius lay in deception. To mislead Ottoman scouts, they staged elaborate ruses. Empty wagons sent rattling down main roads as decoys while the real supplies moved along overgrown game trails. They spread false rumors among merchants about non-existent stockpiles in neighboring towns, drawing enemy raiders away from genuine convoys. One particularly bold officer had his men wear captured Ottoman cloaks to confiscate supplies from enemy depots, marching straight past bewildered sentries. Every trick in the book was used, and a few they likely invented on the spot. What's often forgotten is how they adapted to scarcity. When flour ran low, they mixed sawdust into bread dough to stretch supplies unpalatable, but enough to keep fighters on their feet. When gunpowder grew scarce, they salvaged spent cannonballs from no man's land, recasting them in makeshift furnaces. Even the city's church bells were earmarked for melting into bullets if the siege dragged on. Their resourcefulness turned every scrap of material into a potential weapon, every moment of delay into a victory. The climax of their efforts came in the siege's final days. Knowing Sobiski's relief force was near but unsure exactly when it would arrive, supply officers pulled off their riskiest gamble yet. They deliberately let the Ottomans capture a convoy of wagons. Only these were filled with spoiled grain and barrels of slow-burning pitch. When the enemy triumphantly hauled them into camp, they unknowingly introduced sickness into their ranks and set the stage for fires that would later disrupt their defenses. It was logistics as psychological warfare, a masterstroke that weakened the Ottomans just as the hammer of the relief force fell. While history remembers the flash and thunder of battle, Vienna's survival hinged on these quiet architects of endurance. Their legacy isn't just in the supplies they delivered, but in the lesson they embodied. That wars aren't always won by the strongest army, but by those who can outlast, outthink, and outmaneuver. In the end, the siege wasn't broken by swords alone. It was unraveled by the relentless hands that kept Vienna fed, armed, and stubbornly alive. Amid the roar of cannon fire and the clash of steel, Vienna's signal corps waged a silent war, one where a flick of a flag or the rhythm of a drum could mean the difference between chaos and coordinated triumph. These unsung communicators transformed the fog of battle into a canvas of clarity, their systems stitching together scattered units into a unified force. Picture the scene: Ottoman forces surging toward a weakened bastion, only to be met with a sudden, flawless counterattack, not by chance, but because a scout on a distant tower had spotted the movement and signaled it across the city with a sequence of colored banners. While swords decided individual skirmishes, it was these intricate networks of communication that shaped the battle's very flow. Their methods were as diverse as they were ingenious. By day, semaphore flags flickered like cryptic butterflies between church steeples and bastions, each twirl and angle conveying precise troop movements or enemy positions. At night, lanterns took their place, their light masked by wooden shutters that opened and closed in patterns only Vienna's defenders could decipher. Drumbeats served as the army's pulse, their rhythms differentiating orders to advance, hold, or retreat, a language as vital to soldiers as their native tongues. Even the humble whistle found its place, its shrill notes cutting through the din of combat to direct arquebusier's volleys with split-second timing. What made their work revolutionary wasn't just the tools, but the systems behind them. Every regiment had designated signalmen trained to interpret and relay messages under duress, creating a redundancy that ensured no single point of failure. When Ottoman archers targeted flag bearers, runners would instantly take their place, memorizing codes to shout through the chaos. The corps even developed contingency signals for when standard methods failed. A dropped banner might signal an ambush, while a drum played off rhythm could warn of sappers tunneling below. This wasn't just communication, it was a living, adapting organism that thrived amid disorder. Their crowning achievement came during Sobiski's decisive charge. As Polish Hussars massed on the hills, signal officers atop St. Stephen's Cathedral used mirrored heliographs to coordinate with distant scouts, ensuring the cavalry struck precisely where Ottoman defenses were thinnest. Simultaneously, drummers hidden in the city's sewers echoed the attack order through underground passages, synchronizing the defenders' breakout with the relief force's descent. The Ottomans, reliant on slower courier chains, found themselves outmaneuvered not by strength, but by the sheer speed of Vienna's information web. Yet the Signal Corps' true legacy lay in their democratization of warfare. Where Ottoman commanders waited hours for updates from subordinates, Vienna's lowliest sergeant could read the battle's tide from a glance at the nearest signal tower. This flattening of hierarchy, this trust in shared awareness proved that victory didn't just belong to generals, but to every soldier who could act on timely knowledge. Long after the siege, their innovations would evolve into modern command systems, but their greatest lesson remained timeless, that in war, as in all things, clarity is the ultimate weapon. While armies clashed under the banner of open warfare, Vienna's saboteurs waged a different kind of battle, one fought in moonlit alleys and smoke-filled taverns, where a well-placed rumor could cripple an army as surely as cannon fire. These shadow operatives didn't wear uniforms or stand in formation. They moved through Ottoman camps as laborers, merchants, or even deserters, their true loyalties hidden behind layers of deception. Their mission was simple: unravel the siege from within, one act of sabotage at a time. A barrel of gunpowder accidentally dropped into a river here, a cache of grain mysteriously spoiled there. Each small act of chaos chipped away at the invaders' strength, turning their vast war machine into a stumbling giant. Take the baker's apprentice who smuggled ground glass into sacks of flour destined for Ottoman officers' bread, or the blacksmith who deliberately weakened the iron rims of siege cannon wheels, causing them to shatter under recoil. These weren't just acts of defiance, they were calculated strikes against the Ottoman army's most vulnerable points, its supply lines and morale. The saboteurs' greatest weapon wasn't brute force, but intimate knowledge of how an army functions. They knew that starving soldiers could endure, but an army without gunpowder or functioning weapons was a beast declawed. Disinformation became their deadliest tool. A whispered rumor about unpaid wages could spark mutiny in mercenary ranks. A forged order sent Ottoman sappers digging in the wrong direction for days, wasting precious time and energy. One particularly bold operative even staged an elaborate ruse, dressing as an Ottoman astrologer to predict catastrophe if the siege continued past a certain date, exploiting the superstitious fears of enemy commanders. The Ottomans, reliant on strict hierarchies and centralized command, found themselves paralyzed by doubts they couldn't trace back to their source. The true brilliance of these shadow warriors lay in their invisibility. Unlike battlefield heroes, they left no statues or ballads in their wake. Their victories were measured in the Ottomans' growing frustration, the way supply officers triple-counted barrels, the way commanders hesitated before trusting their own scouts. By the time Sobiski's forces arrived, the invaders were already exhausted from fighting enemies they couldn't see. Vienna's saboteurs proved that war isn't always won in the clash of steel, but in the quiet moments when a single unseen hand can tip the scales. Their legacy lives on in every modern resistance movement, a timeless lesson. Sometimes the most powerful warriors are those who never raise a sword. The story of Vienna's salvation isn't just a tale of individual brilliance, it's a masterclass in the alchemy of alliance. Picture this: Polish Hussars riding alongside German infantry, Bavarian artillerymen sharing powder with Venetian engineers, all under the banner of a cause greater than their old rivalries. These weren't natural allies. Just years before, many had been at each other's throats in conflicts over territory, trade, and faith. Yet when the Ottoman tide threatened to drown Europe, they did the unthinkable. They chose unity over old grudges. The siege didn't just test their military skill, it forced them to rewrite the rules of cooperation under fire. What made this coalition work wasn't some sudden outbreak of brotherhood. It was hard-won pragmatism. Every faction had something to lose if Vienna fell. For the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, it was the threat of Ottoman vassalage. For the Holy Roman Empire, the unraveling of centuries of influence. Even distant Venice, whose traders relied on Mediterranean stability, recognized the stakes, but shared fear alone doesn't build trust. That's where figures like King Sobiski and Duke Charles of Lorraine proved indispensable, turning fragile consensus into operational reality. They didn't erase differences, they made them irrelevant. Polish cavalry tactics blended with German siegecraft. Italian engineers adapted their sapping techniques to Austrian terrain. The coalition became greater than the sum of its parts precisely because it leveraged each nation's strengths without demanding uniformity. The logistical hurdles alone could have shattered lesser alliances. Imagine coordinating supply lines across 3 languages, 4 currencies, and a dozen competing priorities. Bavarian troops expected beer in their rations, Polish lancers needed specific fodder for their prized horses, and Venetian marksmen demanded particular grades of gunpowder. Yet somehow, quartermasters turned this cacophony into harmony. They established neutral depots where goods could be exchanged without political friction, standardized measures for food and ammunition, even created a rudimentary joint command structure where disputes were settled by rotating councils rather than imperial decree. It was bureaucracy as a weapon of war, one that kept the alliance from eating itself alive. Communication became their secret weapon. With messengers taking weeks to traverse the war zone, the coalition developed a shared lexicon of signals, flags, drum patterns, even the arrangement of campfires that cut through language barriers. When Sobiski's scouts spotted an Ottoman weakness, the information didn't get bogged down in translation. It flowed seamlessly to German gunners and Italian sappers. This wasn't just efficiency, it was the birth of modern multinational warfare, proving that unity of action matters more than unity of tongue. Yet the true miracle wasn't in the planning tents but on the battlefield itself. During the final assault, Bavarian infantry advanced in lockstep with Polish cavalry, their movements so synchronized they might have trained together for years. Venetian arquebusiers provided covering fire for Saxon pioneers clearing obstacles. No single nation could have matched the Ottomans alone, but together they created a kaleidoscope of tactics that left the invaders reeling. The lesson echoes through history. Collaboration isn't about surrendering identity, it's about combining distinct strengths to achieve what none could alone. Vienna's defenders left us more than a military blueprint. They showed that even the deepest divisions can be bridged when the stakes are existential. In an age where alliances often feel transactional, their example stands as a reminder. True unity isn't forged in convenience, but in the white-hot crucible of shared necessity. The walls they held weren't just made of stone, they were built from the unlikeliest of bonds, proof that when the moment demands it, even rivals can become guardians of something greater. The thunder of Sobiski's cavalry didn't just break the Ottoman siege, it shattered the trajectory of history itself. Vienna's survival in 1683 wasn't merely a military victory, it was the fulcrum on which Europe's future balanced. For centuries, the Ottomans had been the unstoppable force, their empire stretching across 3 continents, their armies the nightmare of kings. But when they retreated from Vienna's broken walls, something fundamental shifted. This was the moment their westward expansion crested and began its long, slow ebb. The maps we know today, the cultural landscape of Europe, even the aroma of coffee drifting from cafe windows, all trace their roots to those desperate weeks when a handful of defenders refused to let the world as they knew it crumble. Consider the military revolution born from Vienna's ashes. The siege became a laboratory for coalition warfare, proving that rival nations could unite under a common threat, a lesson etched into NATO DNA centuries later. The Polish Winged Hussars' devastating charge inspired generations of cavalry tactics, while Starhemburg's urban defense strategies foreshadowed modern street-by-street combat. Even the improvised medical triage systems pioneered in Vienna's cellars laid groundwork for battlefield medicine. But perhaps the most enduring innovation was psychological. The siege demonstrated that morale could outweigh material, that a city's will to resist could defy even the most crushing odds. Future revolutionaries from Sarajevo to Stalingrad would draw strength from that example. Culturally, the victory preserved a Europe that might have vanished. Had Vienna fallen, the Ottoman advance could have reached the gates of Rome, reshaping art, religion, and philosophy in ways we can scarcely imagine. Instead, the city became a bulwark not just of territory but of ideas. The vibrant intellectual life that flourished there in the 18th century, the music of Mozart echoing through its salons, even the Enlightenment spark, all owed their existence to those who held the line. And then there's the unexpected legacy, coffee. When Jerzy Kulksiki brewed those first cups from abandoned Ottoman beans, he didn't just introduce a drink, he sparked a social revolution. Vienna's coffee houses became incubators of thought, where philosophers, artists, and rebels gathered beneath steam-fogged windows, shaping the modern world one sip at a time. Geopolitically, the siege drew the board. The Ottoman Empire, once the terror of Christendom, began its long decline, its aura of invincibility stripped away. The Habsburgs emerged as Europe's central power, their influence radiating outward for generations, and the fragile alliance that saved Vienna planted seeds for future coalitions, proving that unity could triumph over division when the stakes were high enough. Today, as nations grapple with new threats, cyber warfare, climate crises, pandemics, the siege lessons resonate anew. That isolation is fatal, that innovation thrives under pressure, and that sometimes the most pivotal battles aren't fought for land, but for the soul of civilization itself. The true measure of Vienna's legacy isn't found in textbooks or battle diagrams, but in the quiet moments that followed the child who grew up free to study music instead of servitude, the scholar who penned revolutionary ideas in a coffee-stained notebook, the ordinary citizen who never knew how close their world came to vanishing. History turns on such hinges, not just the roar of cannons, but the stubborn refusal to let the light go out. In that sense, Vienna's defenders didn't just win a battle. They gifted us the future we inhabit, one fragile, hard-won day at a time. The Siege of Vienna isn't just a chapter in a history book. It's a living blueprint for confronting crises today. Take leadership under pressure. Starhemburg's ability to inspire a starving city mirrors modern CEOs steering companies through economic collapse, or doctors rallying teams during a pandemic. His lesson, true leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about creating the conditions for others to find them. When he walked the crumbling walls alongside common soldiers, he wasn't just boosting morale, he was flattening hierarchies in a way that would make today's most innovative workplaces nod in recognition. The same principle applies to social movements, where authentic presence often outweighs top-down commands. Then there's the coalition's masterclass in unity. Vienna's defenders, Poles, Germans, Italians, proved that collaboration isn't about erasing differences, but leveraging them. Modern parallels abound. International climate agreements where rival nations pool technology, or global health initiatives bridging political divides. The siege reminds us that the most daunting challenges, whether cyber warfare or ecological collapse, demand Vienna's model. Specialized skills stitched together by shared purpose. Even Silicon Valley's cross-industry collaborations echo the Habsburgs' unlikely alliance with Sobiski, where competitors became allies because the stakes rendered old rivalries irrelevant. Military strategists still dissect Vienna's asymmetric warfare tactics. The city's scouts and saboteurs were the 17th century equivalent of modern special ops, small, agile teams disrupting a larger force's logistics. Ukraine's use of decentralized drone units against a numerically superior invader, straight from Vienna's playbook. The defenders' psychological operations spreading disinformation, exploiting enemy superstitions, find eerie resonance in today's digital battlespace, where a well-placed rumor on social media can sway public opinion as decisively as any cannonade. But perhaps the most urgent lesson is resilience. Vienna's citizens didn't just endure, they adapted, transforming every resource, from church bells to sewer tunnels, into tools of survival. In an era of supply chain disruptions and resource scarcity, their ingenuity offers a roadmap. When Japanese engineers rebuilt bullet trains to withstand earthquakes, or when communities repurpose abandoned buildings into emergency housing. They're channeling the same spirit that turned coffee beans into currency and rubble into barricades. The siege's ultimate legacy isn't in the past tense. It's in the quiet moments when a leader chooses transparency over control, when rivals prioritize solutions over pride, or when ordinary people discover extraordinary resourcefulness. Vienna didn't just hold the line against an empire. It showed that the future belongs to those who can outthink, outadapt, and outlast. And in a world where the next siege might be digital, environmental, or ideological, that's a playbook we can't afford to forget. The Siege of Vienna stands as a testament to what humanity can achieve when ingenuity, courage, and collaboration converge under impossible pressure. These 25 military minds didn't just defend a city, they redefined the art of the possible. Think of Starhemburg holding a starving populace together through sheer force of will, or Sobiski uniting fractious allies into a hammer blow of deliverance. Consider the saboteurs who turned everyday skills into weapons, or the medics who fought death itself with nothing but herbs and hope. Their victory wasn't guaranteed by numbers or technology, but by something far more powerful: the refusal to accept defeat as inevitable. What makes their legacy timeless isn't just the battle they won, but the way they won it through adaptability, creativity, and an unshakable belief in their cause. The Ottoman Empire had superior forces, seasoned commanders, and centuries of expansion behind them. Vienna had something better: a coalition of unlikely allies who discovered that unity isn't about erasing differences but harnessing them. The Polish cavalry's thunderous charge, the German engineers' relentless repairs, the Italian diplomats' whispered negotiations. Each played a vital role because each brought something unique to the fight. This story resonates because it mirrors challenges we still face today. Whether confronting global crises or personal struggles, the siege teaches us that breakthroughs happen when we refuse to be constrained by conventional thinking. The defenders didn't just hold the line, they rewrote the rules, turning coffee beans into currency and sewer tunnels into supply routes. Their ingenuity whispers across the centuries. No obstacle is insurmountable if you're willing to see possibilities where others see dead ends. As the dust settled that September in 1683, Europe awoke to a new reality. The Ottoman tide, once unstoppable, had finally met its match not in sheer force, but in the collective brilliance of those who dared to fight smarter, not just harder. Vienna's survival didn't just preserve a city, it safeguarded the cultural and intellectual currents that would shape the modern world. From the coffeehouses where ideas percolated to the alliances that redefined diplomacy, the ripple effects of their triumph are still felt today. If these stories of resilience and resourcefulness inspired you, let us know in the comments whose strategy left you in awe. Was it Kulksiki's audacious espionage, or perhaps Piccolamine's guerrilla tactics? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into history's pivotal moments, because understanding how ordinary people achieved extraordinary things doesn't just honor the past, it equips us to face the future. Until next time, remember, the greatest breakthroughs often begin when someone refuses to believe the odds are insurmountable.